Okay, so we'll get started. So good morning and thank you for joining us for an informational webinar on the CCS National Change of Address or NCOA group submission. My name is Mieko. I'm the Member Services Librarian for Public Services here at CCS. I'm also joined here today by Bob Barth, who is the CCS IT Systems Administrator and everyone's favorite data person. So like I just said, this webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording, the chat log, and links to any resources we discuss in a follow-up email to registrants, and also watch for a link posted in this week's CCS e-newsletter. So I'm just going to get started here by just quickly going over the agenda. The big goal of today is to make sure that you hear about the project in detail. So that's what the bulk of this webinar will cover. We're also going to start out with a brief overview of what the NCOA service is and what the CCS group submission looks like. Then we'll take each stage of the project step by step. And this is where we'll really spend time talking about like who is eligible for submission, what your patron record bulk update options are, and things you should think about when reviewing the returned data after it's been run through the NCOA database. And then we'll finish up by reviewing the 2021 submission timeline, and whatever Q&A is left at the end, we'll take some time to go over those questions. So let me just start by answering the question, what is Unique's NCOA service? So NCOA, or NCOA, stands for National Change of Address. And the USPS maintains a National Change of Address database for users who have moved and submitted their new address to the post office. Basically, Unique has access to this database, and they can take a file of patron records from our ILS and run it through the USPS NCOA database. And by doing this, they can compare addresses and see who in that patron file has moved and who still resides at their same location. And by having this information, who has moved and who has not, this really gives libraries the opportunity to streamline some card services. So for libraries whose cards expire, this can give you the opportunity to extend users' expiration dates without them needing to come into the library and show proof of address. For libraries who offer non-expiring cards, this service can allow you to see who may have moved away, and then you can block their card and note that you need to maybe verify their address. So in previous years, libraries have chosen to contract individually with Unique. However, from this point forward, CCS will be offering you an additional option. CCS will be coordinating an annual group submission for Unique's NCOA service beginning this year. Now, some of the benefits of participating with the group submission instead of individually includes a centralized coordination with Unique. So CCS will be the one like signing the paperwork on behalf of all participating libraries. Will be the ones submitting the files and receiving the completed files back. So the libraries don't have to deal with a third party. They can go through CCS for everything. Additionally, if you're contracting with Unique individually, they have minimum requirements that the library needs to meet. The minimum submission for contracting with an individual library is a minimum payment of $750 or a minimum submission of 50,000 patron records. However, with our group submission, that minimum requirement is waived. So by participating in a group submission, this means your library can submit maybe just $150 worth of patron records instead of spending $750 just to meet that minimum. So that's a huge benefit of getting grouped in with this submission. And then finally, by participating in the group submission, CCS will be the ones who extract the data, and we can also perform those bulk updates. So I don't know if anyone here has gone through, has worked with Unique individually for this, but if you didn't know, Unique and the NCOA database, they don't have a way to integrate with the Polaris ILS. So any changes or updates to patron records will have to be either manually done by library staff or by CCS. So by participating in that group submission, CCS will be the ones who like extract the data and bulk update the data. I just want to emphasize that this service is like entirely opt-in. We will be doing a group submission every year. So if you're not able to or interested in participating this year, but want to plan on it for next year, you definitely can. And also, if you want to participate this year and then you don't feel the need to participate the following year, that's completely okay too. So if you participate one year, you're not tied in to using this service every single year. It's definitely a thing where whatever is convenient for you, you can participate. If it's not a good year, you don't have to participate. Now, in terms of cost, Unique currently charges $0.015 per patron record. And to put that into some perspective, if you submit 2,000 patrons, that's equivalent to $30. If you submit 10,000 patrons, that comes out to $150. So depending on how many patrons you want to submit, it can be a relatively inexpensive service. And libraries will only pay for the patrons they submit. So those will be patrons that are registered to your library. And libraries will always be able to review the submission file and know how many records are going to be submitted ahead of time in case there's any adjustments that you want to make. CCS will invoice libraries individually for their specific file when the work is complete. And libraries will submit payment to CCS so they don't have to worry about sending any payments directly to Unique. So what I want to do now, let me just pause for a second here and just see if anyone has questions.
I do. What
Yeah.
about the reciprocal borrowers? Will those be included at all or no?
No, those will not be included. So the only patrons who are eligible to be submitted are patrons registered to a CCS library.
Thanks.
Mhm. Okay, again, stop me anytime if you have questions. But what I want to do now is kind of give you an overview of the project, and then we'll go into more detail for each step. So the first part of the project is this pre-submission phase, and this is just kind of when we're getting ready to submit the file. Now, if you're interested in participating, the first thing you want to do is open a help desk ticket with CCS. And through that ticket, CCS will work with the library to determine which patrons you want to send and which updates you want to see. And we'll create a patron file for you to just double check and review before we send it along. The next steps are the submission and return. At this time, CCS will send a file to Unique. Unique will run that file through the NCOA database, and when complete, will return the file to CCS. They say the turnaround time for returning the file is typically about 1 week, so it's a pretty fast service. And once CCS has the file back, we'll post it to web reports and we'll notify staff via the help desk ticket that the file is ready for you to review. At that time, we then move into the review and update stage, where the library will review the patron file and remove any records they don't want to be included in the update. We'll have more on this in the detailed overview. And after that review is complete, the library lets CCS know they're ready. CCS will perform the desired bulk updates. And again, we'll go into detail about what updates we can do in just a moment. And then finally, if needed, libraries can inform patrons of changes. So it would be up to your library if you wanted to put out like a marketing message or an email blast about any changes to the cards. So with that, Let's dig into each stage of the project. So the very first thing you will want to do is open a help desk ticket to let CCS know you want to participate in the NCOA group submission. This ticket will be the anchor for all NCOA related question and answers, any updates, we'll post any documents there and more. So you'll be working with Bob and I through the ticket. And the first thing that we're going to do is link you to this form, the NCOA group submission. It's like an intent to participate form. And this form is what we'll use to organize your library's submission qualifications and what bulk updates you want to see after that patron file is returned back to us. So when you are filling out this form, this is the kind of things that you'll need to think about during this pre-submission stage. First, in terms of the patron submission criteria, we will be using the patron statistical class code to qualify patrons. So patrons who have a stat class code of resident or student will be considered. And by using the stat class code, we can most easily exclude users such as like non-resident patrons who pay annually for a fee card, in-house and test accounts, and accounts that may require regular staff intervention like businesses and schools and outreach. Also, the only users who will be considered for your submission file, like we just mentioned, are users registered to your library. So any users who are non-CCS reciprocal borrowers or ILL library accounts, so those are the users that have a registered at branch of CCSB or ILL for CCS, those users will not be sent in. Finally, CCS will only send users who have an address on file with an address type label of home. So for example, if you have a user and for some reason they only have like a work file on address with you, those addresses will not be sent in. Also, patrons who have more than one address in the record with a type label of home are not eligible to be submitted. And the big reason for this is to help reduce the number of false positives in the return file. Because if a user, like I said, if the user only has their work address on file in the ILS, NCOA is going to tell us that they've moved. If the user has multiple home addresses on file, NCOA is going to tell us that the user has moved because one of those addresses is not going to be their current primary residence on file with the USPS. So beyond that, submission criteria is going to depend on your intent with the project. So if your intent is to identify patrons who have moved away from the service area, or like is your intent to identify valid cards to auto renew? And the intent for the service is going to differ based on library. For a library whose cards don't expire, an NCOA report may serve as an alert to identify patrons who've moved out of the service area. For libraries who continue to offer cards that have expiration date and or an address check date, this service would likely be used to identify valid cards to auto renew. So based on that, there's two different ways that you can further qualify patrons. And the first way is to submit all unexpired patron records with a stat class code of resident or student. So this option would more likely be for users who offer non-expiring cards and want to identify patrons who've potentially moved away. The second way is to submit patrons that fall within a specific expiration period. So for example, if you know you're going to participate in this project every other year, you may then opt to send users whose cards have an expiration date between now and say the end of 2023. So this option would obviously be for libraries whose cards have an expiration date. And when you're filling out that form, we will ask you to specify both an expiration date period and an address check date period. So that is the what you need to think about in terms of submitting patrons. The other thing you will determine during the pre-submission stage is what bulk updates you want to see to patron records after they're run through the NCOA database. Now, I just want to say real quick before I detail what updates are available, bulk updates are optional. So if by chance your library just wants to jump on the group submission to have a return file from NCOA and would prefer to handle any record updates or changes in-house, you totally can. For those libraries who are interested in bulk updates to patron records, these are the ones that you will see or have available. One update that is going to be consistent for all libraries is that any patrons whose record is bulk updated during this process will have a non-blocking note added to their account. So if the patron's record was returned indicating that they have moved, a note saying new address returned via NCOA will be added like the screenshot on the left. If the patron's record was returned indicating they still live at that address, a note saying patron address validated via NCOA will be added like the screenshot on the right. So no matter what, anytime a patron is updated within this project, they will have a non-blocking note added to their record. Beyond the note, libraries can select from the following. So for users who have not moved, CCS can extend their expiration to a particular date, and in the form, you will specify the new expiration date. Also, this may not apply to all libraries, but if your library also has an address check date period, CCS can extend the address check date for users who have not moved. I know there's some libraries out there who like by default have that period set to 99 years. But I think there's still a number of libraries who have it automatically set to 3 years. So that's another thing that we can bulk update. And again, you will specify a new address check date on the form. Additionally, for users who have moved, libraries can choose to add a library assigned block to the user's card. And this block will say invalid address in COA to indicate that the block was related to this project. Oops. Like the existing invalid address block, this will, uh, a block will appear when staff are checking out to the patron. This will prevent auto renewal if the patron still has items checked out, and will stop the patron from what we refer to as any patron initiated circulation, which means it will stop them at a self-check. It will stop them from renewing online through the Power Pack or by calling in through telephony, or from checking out e-content. And just like the other library assigned blocks, this one can be manually removed by staff if needed, or if they've worked with the patron and everything is resolved. Any staff can take that block off. The other bulk update libraries can opt to do for users who have moved is to update their address fields based on what information NCOA returns. So what this entails is CCS will add the patron's new address to the record and will give that address a label of home. The existing address will still remain in the patron's record, but the label type will change to previous home, or abbreviated as PREV home. So this way staff will have reference to both what is reported as the new address and what the old address on file was. And this screenshot down here in the corner shows you what it looks like when clicking on the properties eye icon in a patron record. So you'll have a quick visual to both the home address, which again is the one that the USPS reports is their new address, and the pre home address, which is the one that was previously listed as their home address in the ILS. And then I also just kind of want to show you what it looks like in the patron registration work form. So this is a record that's been updated. The patron was reported as having moved, and this is what was returned as their new address. So now it displays as the first address listed in their record and has an address label type of home. And scrolling down, this was the existing address that was in the ILS and was sent through the NCOA database for review. So this was reported as their old address, still in their record, and the address label has been updated to previous home, again, as a visual for staff. So those are the data and record related decisions you'll use that form to make during the pre-submission stage. Always, if you have any questions along the way as you're filling the form out, CCS can help talk you through any decisions here. So once we settle on who is going to be submitted and what you want to do with the returned data, CCS will then compile the qualifying patrons for submission. And before submission, we will share the list of patrons in an Excel file. So before anything is submitted, you'll have a number of patrons that will be submitted, so you know the cost, and you can also just take a quick glance or review the list of patrons. And then once you confirm that the submission looks good, we'll send it off to Unique. So that brings us into the next stage of the project, the submission and return stage. This stage is pretty straightforward. There's nothing the libraries need to worry about doing in this stage. So again, after the library confirms that the patron submission list looks okay, CCS will send the file to Unique. Unique will then run the list of patrons in the file against the National Change of Address database. And when complete, they will send the updated file back to CCS. And again, the turnaround time for this is pretty quick, typically about a week. And I'm just going to pause to check the chat real quick. When the address is changed and the prev home address added, will the patron be blocked so we can make sure they're still in their district? Yes, you can. So during that pre-submission phase, when you're figuring out like all what you want us to do in terms of bulk changes with those patron records, you can say, I want both the address updated and I want the patrons blocked. So we can do both at once. Any other questions at this time? So yeah, once we have that updated patron file back, we'll post it to web reports for easy access. Uh, someone else in your department can definitely log into web reports and access that file, that report. And we'll also post it to the ticket that we have open with you at the library, so you've got multiple areas to access that list. So in terms of like, what does this return file look like? I just want to take a moment and show you what information you'll see in there. So the file we send to Unique will include the patron's ID number, which is their Polaris control number. It will include their library card number, their name, and the address they have on file with the library. And these are the columns with the ORIG or original prefix. When Unique returns the file back to us, they include the following data. There's a column with the label new address, and this column will either contain a yes to indicate the patron has a different address on file with the USPS, or be blank to indicate the address on file with the USPS matches the address on file with the library. So that column gives us a nice quick visual to see whose address is different, whose address is the same. Then there are the columns with the prefix of STD. Unique will include the address on file with the USPS here. So if the patron has moved, these columns will give us the updated information. If the patron has not moved, the address in these columns will be the same as address as the patron has on file with the library. And then you'll also see a couple of CCS use columns. One is a column headed message, and this is where we can indicate if the patron's record was bulk changed or if we were unable to bulk change, and we'll provide the reason here. The other CCS use column is the date process column, and this is where we will include a date timestamp of when the patron's record is updated. And then there's a couple other data points that will be included in the patron spreadsheet that doesn't appear in this sample file screenshot. So one additional column you will see will indicate if the patron has multiple addresses on file with the library. And this is just so that it's easier for libraries to visually pick out who may have multiple properties, and who may have that false positive return from the NCOA database. And the second addition to the spreadsheet will be the patron's email address if they have one on file. And this is so that libraries can send the users an email blast if they wanted to, just send out something saying, hey, congratulations, your card's been renewed for another 3 years. So now that we have that file back and it's available for libraries to review, we then move into the review and update stage of the project. This stage is going to be the most labor intensive part of the project for libraries because this is where you'll need to review the patron file and really focus on those users who are reported as having moved before CCS is able to make any updates. Library staff will have 60 days to review the file. So when you're ready to review the file, you'll download the Excel file so you can make edits to it. You'll review the file, and then, if there's any weird patrons in there that have like weird situations and you don't want them bulk updated, all you have to do is remove that patron from the file, and then they will be excluded from any updates. So additionally, this is kind of where we come into the gray area of the project, because there's no real set or at this time strongly recommended way that you should review the file. So this is an area where your library can determine how you want to move forward with the patrons who have moved. And some questions you may want to consider for this stage are like, how closely are you going to look at each record? Will you look at every person who says they moved to see if like maybe they're still actively using the card and checking things out? Will you try searching out information online to see if there's public record of them moving or if there's a property transfer? Or will you say, you know what, the reporting is moved, let's block the card and we'll let the patron come to us if there's an issue. For users who have reported as having moved, but whose cards you find are still actively being used, how will you block or handle their cards differently than, say, like the stale cards? So if the patron is reported as having a Florida address, but they've recently checked out physical books from the library, that could be a sign that the patron owns dual properties in Illinois and Florida. Or maybe if the patron is reported as having a Florida address and only checks out ebooks, that could potentially be more solid evidence that the user has permanently moved. And then another thing to be aware of are users who have moved but may still reside in your service area. So you'll just have to think about, how do you want to handle those cards, right? Do you want to leave those as is? Do you want to block them so they have to come in and register their new address with you? Or maybe there's another option that will work for your library. And then finally, you just kind of want to, in the back of your mind, have a plan for how you want to handle users who you suspect have multiple addresses on file, or who have like a PO box on file. So earlier we talked about like those false positives, where the patron may have a valid address on file with USPS and also have a different but equally valid address on file with the library. So you're probably going to run into the occasional patron who has two separate properties, but hasn't given all of that information to the library. And there's going to be situations probably where there's just no way for the library to know this before putting a block on the patron's card. So you just need to be prepared for that. Um, so it's a couple things to think about. I did want to just include some examples of how other libraries who have previously used the NCOA service reviewed patron records. This is just something, I'm just sharing ideas. I'm not endorsing or like asking that you use all these methods. Just kind of want to share some ideas. So I have heard from staff who've used their county property tax lookup tool to see who owns the property. So this might be helpful for users who may still reside in your service area. This could be a way to double check that they're still paying taxes to the library and eligible for a card. Um, and uh, I think one thing to definitely keep in mind here that there will probably definitely be rental situations. So it's not going to be like a 100% fail-safe situation. Um, Other libraries have also made use of Google or other search tools or databases to check for public records of transfer. And then I've also heard from staff who said they will check to see when a card was last used or if the patron is currently using the card. Because of the card, if there's been no activity in card, they don't have anything checked out. That can indicate that the patron is long gone from your service area. If the card is still actively being used, you may decide you don't want to include it in the bulk updates and work with that patron individually. So I don't know if anyone here has contracted individually with Unique for the NCOA update. If you have and you've gone through this review process and you have any tips or recommendations, I'd be very interested in hearing what worked or what did not work for your library. I'm just going to pause for a second just in case. Well, if ever you are talking with some colleagues and you get wind that they've worked with NCOA before, this would definitely be something to just kind of check in with them about, see what's worked. And again, like I said, I don't think that there is a one size fits all way to review. I think it's definitely going to depend on how many patrons you're looking at too, and how much time that your library has to devote to reviewing the patron file. Um, so once again, uh, once you have that returned Excel file from Unique, downloaded the file, reviewed the patrons, removed any entries you don't want bulk updated with the rest. And then when you're all done with reviewing the patron records and you've removed any you don't want updated, you'll give the file back to CCS. So basically just attach it to the help desk ticket or email thread that you've got going on with CCS. Um, and that is what we will use then to do the bulk update. So at this time, CCS will perform the bulk updates. We will perform them in the order in which libraries sign off on the changes. And we have the capacity to perform bulk updates for one library per day. So we'll definitely, once you give that return file back to us, we'll definitely communicate to you okay, we've got, 3 libraries lined up. You'll be number 4, and this is the anticipated date we'll have the bulk updates complete. And then once again, to very quickly review what bulk updates are available to libraries for this project, we will be adding that non-blocking note to every patron who is updated through this project. And the note will change depending on if the patron is reported as having moved or if the patron has not moved. For users who have not moved, we can extend their expiration date to a particular time. And we will also extend the address check date if applicable for your library. And then for users who have moved, CCS can add that library assigned block to the user's card, which will say invalid address and NCOA to indicate that the block was related to this project. And then finally, the other bulk update you can opt to do for users who have moved is update their address fields based on what information NCOA returns. So CCS will add the patron's new address to the record and will give that address label of home. The existing address will still remain in the patron record, but the label type will change to previous home. So this way, staff will have reference for both what is reported as the old address and the new address in the patron's record. And just kind of going back to the question you had earlier about adding, updating the addresses and adding the block. One thing too that you can opt to do for your library, if you feel comfortable signing off on the bulk updates, you know, before like really doing a deep dive into those patient records, like you can do a quick review of those patient records, sign off on the bulk updates, CCS can update them, and then you know you can take the rest of the summer if you want to really like dive into each patient who's reported as having moved, and do research there, and then you can like manually remove the block if you need. So just wanted to put that out there as a potential option. Um, Let me just pop into the chat real quick. Oh, this is a good question. Assuming libraries who opt in will be checking and validating addresses, what's the point and value of the non-blocking note that staff would presumably see at every checkout? That is just so staff have an idea of, so when CCS does the bulk updates, CCS is going to be listed as the last person who modified the record. So having that non-blocking note in there is just a way to communicate to staff, like this is why CCS was in this patron's record making updates. And so that there isn't any kind of like gray area or questions about like, you know, if we adjusted non-related fields. And of course, you know, if you need to, if you've checked the addresses and everything, I suppose you can remove that non-blocking note if you need. I'm gonna pause just for a second in case there's any other questions. Okay, and then finally, we come to the end of the review and update stage of the project. So once the bulk updates is complete, we consider the project completed and resolved. The library can then decide for themselves if you want to market any changes. So like if you want to send an email blast or a mailer to users, informing them of any changes, or you know, if you need to follow up with any individual patrons. So if you are participating in this year's group submission, here are the deadlines and target dates that we are looking at. If you're interested in participating in this year's group submission, we need to know by May 12th. This is so that we have enough time to get the patron file ready, and you have time to review before submitting it to Unique. So May 12th is your deadline for opening that help desk ticket. We expect to send the files off to Unique on May 26th. And Unique anticipates needing roughly 1 week to run the files through the database and get the data back to us. Excuse me, we anticipate having the return files back in early June. Once we have those return files back, post them to web reports and the tickets, libraries will have 60 days to review the patron data, which we estimate will take us through the end of July. And then when you're finished with the review, CCS will perform the bulk update. So this is what the 2021 submission timeline looks like. And then finally, we encourage you to visit the Learning Portal page on the NCOA group submission for the project information in print form. The URL is on the screen. I believe it was also on the agenda, and I will definitely include it in the webinar follow-up email. That page has an overview of the project plus an FAQ for questions that we've received. And it also links to a full PDF guide, and you can also see a preview of that intent to participate form on there if you want. And you can find, if you're just kind of like navigating through the Learning Portal, you can find that page under the Public Services Procedures under the Record Maintenance section. So that is kind of the group submission in detail. So again, if there's any questions you have at this moment, like I said, I definitely wanted to make sure we had plenty of time for that. And always, if later in the day 2 p.m. hits and you find you have a question, you can just email them to help@ccslib.org, and we will get back to you there.
Well, I have a question. Is the last activity date included on that report that CCS will send us?
At this time, it isn't. Um, I'm going to see, Bob, is that something that we could potentially add to the report?
I had trouble there unmuting myself. Actually, I've already written it down. Yes, we will.
Oh, perfect.
Last activity date.
Thanks, Bob. So in case anyone didn't hear, yes, the last activity date will be included in that report. Oh, and also one thing I do want to mention is that CCS, when CCS does the bulk updates, we are able to bulk update the patron's record and not impact the last activity date. So the patron's last activity date will remain the same as it is. I'm just going to open up the chat here. Oh, good, good. Well, at this time, I am, if there's no other questions, I am going to go ahead and stop the recording. And like I said, we will, I'll get this video, the recording uploaded and send it out to all of the registered attendees for the webinar. Watch for a link to the video in this Friday's CCS e-news as well. And again, if you have any questions that you think of later, definitely just shoot off an email to help@ccslib.org, and we will answer your question there. So let me stop the recording.